and to show you a little bit about what I've been doing in Western Maryland with the Maryland Nature Conservancy. I see Gabe Cahalan is on the call today, so he's my co-conspirator down there at TNC in Bethesda, and he's helped me a lot with this, but I'm super excited. This is a picture of the view that you get if you climb all the way to the top of Catoctin Mountain. I think this is called Chimney Rock. Maybe some of you have visited this area. So we did a fire history in this area of Catoctin Mountain for a couple of different reasons, but generally speaking, fire history is a tool that, or is a way for us to figure out how fire has affected the forests that are growing there now. It's also a tool to help us plan for the future. So it shows that fire was an important component of forests in the past, which is a good thing for people to get their brains around, especially if managers would like to reintroduce fire to an area that hasn't burned in a long time. Having evidence that shows that fire has burned there is something that can be really, really helpful from a public relations standpoint. But from a scientific standpoint, it also gives you some really interesting details about how the fires used to burn. For example, based on fire scars on trees and other evidence, you can figure out how often fires burned. How many years was it before fire came back to the same place? Some fires burned really hot and scarred lots of trees, and other fires just burned coolly or maybe patchily and only burned one tree here and there. So you get not only frequency but intensity. If you GPS all of your stumps and fire scarred trees, you've got spatial extent. So there's a lot of information that you can get from doing a fire history study, and that identifies the range of variability in the historic fire that created the environmental situation in which the current forest grew up. So that's useful for burn managers to know today. It's not necessarily that any kind of controlled burn should mimic past fires, but you should understand these are the conditions that created the situation where the forest germinated and grew up the way it did. So if you want those types of things again, this is one way to look at it. But it's also important to study fire history because fire is, by the general public, is often misunderstood and feared. It's viewed as a destructive force. When it's written about in the newspapers, the language is usually tragic. It's viewed as, forest fires are viewed as a waste. The human toll is in certain areas is definitely awful. Like Gatlinburg in 2016 down in Tennessee, where half the town burned up. But part of the reason that was able to happen is that there was a misunderstanding of fire, that fire doesn't happen here. And in the East, fire does happen. It has historically happened. And it's becoming more of an issue with climate change. As we go forward, having a better understanding of historic fires will help us prepare for the future. Now, in the northeastern US, not only is it getting warmer, but there are other changes as well. So for example, we are getting more inches of precipitation in Pennsylvania. And as you can see in the last few years, that's definitely true. But in general, that's been true with climate change. But even though we're getting more rain, it comes in larger doses. So there's also an increase in the frequency of droughts. So lots of rain equals lots of growth of fine fuels, and then droughts dry them out, and then you have a situation perhaps for the perfect storm of having lots of fires. So what this is showing right here is how the weather in, let's see, in the 1980s for each of these towns is becoming more like the weather in southern states. So Scranton by 2050 will have weather that was like Northern Virginia in the 1980s, which is pretty crazy. But that's what the models are telling us. So back to Catoctin for a moment. Let me give you a little bit of like a cultural history. This area was actually owned by Native Americans for since time immemorial. So Algonquins and Lenape peoples had it up until the 18th century when the Tuscarora, which are a member of the Iroquois Confederacy, took over. Europeans started arriving in 1729 with the first German settlers, and it wasn't really a town until the 1750s. At that point, there was a town called Mechanicstown that was later renamed to Thurmont in the 1890s. Thurmont is the town where Catoctin is. But this town was initially quite diverse. Lots of different European peoples and enslaved African peoples made up the population. Also contributed to agriculture and industry. A lot of the industrial stuff and all the knowledge, a lot of the knowledge was held by enslaved peoples, Native American and African. The biggest industry in the area was a coal iron furnace. And if you've ever driven around Pennsylvania and other places in this area of the Mid-Atlantic, you'll see these all over the place. This is the way that cast iron was made. So this furnace would generate lots of heat and it would melt the iron out of iron ore that would come down this channel here, and then the pig iron could be converted into things like cannons and cannonballs and Franklin stoves and other cast iron implements, pots and pans that would have been used by people back in the day. To get that heat and to fuel this furnace, initially charcoal was used. And the way that charcoal is made is that lots of people would go up into the hills and chop down lots of trees, hardwoods in particular, because oaks have a lot more BTUs per weight than pine. And they would bury the stacks of trees and then burn them at low oxygen. That creates lots of charcoal. So these folks right here were part of the ongoing team of people that were doing the charcoaling. They were colliers. They would live in these huts, and they'd make charcoal up there, and then it would be brought down to the furnace. And if you do this for a couple hundred years, you pretty much denude the entire hillsides, pretty much as far as the eye can see around the furnace. And that's what happened at Catoctin. The oaks could resprout if they were cut young enough, and sort of a coppicing situation would happen where about every 30 years or so you could go back and cut the same forest and remake it into charcoal. Here on the right-hand picture at the bottom, you can see that it wasn't just one iron furnace, it was an entire complex of several furnaces, and it was working up until the early 20th century. And that would have been a way to start lots of different fires in the woods. However, by the early 20th century, industrial logging in this form and in other forms throughout the United States had created a public backlash because so much of the mountains just looked like a moonscape. Clear cutting, industrial clear cutting with no regulations, and the fires that ensued from the steam engines and other things just left a burned over moonscape. People didn't like that. And so by the 1920s, we had a conservation ethic that created the Forest Service, that created national parks, and created this national policy of fire suppression. Fires were seen as a very negative thing in the 1920s, and in fact, it was true, they were. And if they burned as often as they were burning, they were preventing regeneration of the forests. However, if you do fire suppression for 100 years, in areas where the species of plants are fire adapted, you put those plants at an ecological disadvantage. And what we see in some areas is a loss of reproduction of fire adapted species. Oaks and pines are both fire adapted in different ways, and we're seeing across the Mid-Atlantic sort of a crisis in regeneration in both of those. Also, something that we see concurrently is that mesic shade tolerant species tend to come in underneath them and will be the next stage in succession. So if you come in and you log your oaks out of the canopy, what comes up is other stuff, like red maple, things that aren't fire tolerant necessarily. And Greg Nowacki and Mark Abrams' 2008 paper on lesification is a really great resource for explaining this process. So what we're dealing with is a context of fire suppression throughout the United States, but in particular has been very effective in the East. Not entirely effective, that we had some fires in some areas. These pictures are from Sword Mountain, which isn't too far away. I think maybe about 40 miles away from Catoctin to the west. And you can actually see that we have a little bit of an open canopy. There's, almost like a woodland rather than a forest situation. We have healthy ericaceous shrubs growing here in the understory, and right here in the lower right is a Table Mountain pine seedling. So if you do get fire on some of these ridges, you can see that the fire-adapted species that haven't reproduced in a really long time have a chance to do so. And that's good for keeping the habitat going, but also it's good for if you're a wildlife biologist and you care about game and non-game animals and birds, that's good for them as well. So these ridges usually contain pitch pine, oaks, chestnut oak is a common one, and ericaceous shrubs in the understory like black huckleberry, various blueberries, and mountain laurel. If we move to Catoctin though, you can see that the forest canopy is a lot more closed. A lot of these leaves up here are of black gum, which casts a lot more shade than pines and oaks do. And the shady understory has sort of created this depauperate flora here. We still have blueberries and black huckleberries, but they're struggling, as you can see. We have these tall 3 or 4 meter mountain laurels, but they're struggling as well, sort of over mature. We have a lot of coarse woody debris on the ground. So we have a lot of fuel, but fires haven't burned in a long time, and we have leaf litter, we have shade. It's not good for reproduction of a lot of these species. You also see lots and lots of evidence that fire was once part of the ecology of these areas. So here's a stump or a snag with fire scars on it. This tree had a fire scar. It's actually underneath, but it's actually rotted and fallen over. If you cut some of these, you can see that carpenter ants have done a lot of damage. And we have to do a lot of repair work before we can measure something like that. But I put these pictures up here to show that the evidence that we have on the ground of previous fires is in the process of decomposing. And if we come back in 10 or 20 years, we're going to lose a lot of this evidence. So this is one reason to go out today and do fire history studies instead of waiting. We need to get this stuff, and we need to get it now. So the purpose of the study at Catoctin is we want to collect fire history information to aid in the design of controlled burn strategies in Maryland, not only in Catoctin, but other wildlife management areas and nature conservancy preserves in the state. And like you said, the physical evidence is going away, so we need to get it now. We're in a state where there are only 2 fire history studies published that I know of. One of them was a 1987 really small study at Catoctin that we're going to build on. The other one is Shumway's study at Savage Mountain in the extreme western part of the state. We just need more information. According to these previous studies, we're looking at a fairly short fire return interval in both cases, but there's not a lot of trees. So we got 8 pines here, we got 20 oaks in that study, so only 28 trees in the entire state of Maryland have been dated and published as a fire history prior to this work. In neighboring states, we have lots and lots of other papers. We could definitely use more, but we've got Brose and Joe Marshall, Serena Aldrich, and Emily Silver, and Amy Hessel doing work in neighboring states. So there's some references for you if you'd like to get information from those. And what I expect is to find similar situations at Catoctin that we find in some of those other papers, like frequent fire prior to the fire suppression era, like 10 or 15-year fire return intervals. And then I would expect after the fire suppression era kicks in that fires would just stop. Secondly, I would expect that fire years may be correlated with drought. So we can use the historic Palmer Drought Severity Index information and see if the years that fires burn are drier than the average year. Thirdly, I expect that fire-adapted tree species are going to be struggling. So maybe we'll see them in the canopy, but we won't see a lot of oaks and pines reproducing. And according to what we see in some other areas, I expect to find music species reproducing a lot. So these are my 3 hypotheses we'll revisit at the end, and we'll see if they actually come true. We may have to modify some of those. But my goals for the webinar today are not only to give you a fire history of Catoctin, but to give you a sense of how fire histories are created in general, how you do this. I'll walk you through the field and laboratory methods, how to cross-date trees and analyze them, and then show you what you can do with this information, because there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with fire histories. So here's Maryland. That's Shumway's study. Here's Catoctin. So that's the geographic context of where we are. We're northwest of Baltimore. Frederick is probably the biggest town to the south, and Gettysburg to the north. Here's a close-up of the aerial photo where our study area is. If anybody's ever been to Catoctin Park, you drive up Route 77, and here's the visitor center. If you continue up this road, over here off to the left is Camp David. So you often see black SUVs going back and forth with tinted windows. You just try to ignore that and go about your business. But this hillside right here is where we found all of our fire scars. It's a south and west facing slope, which is hotter and drier than north and east facing aspects. And this is where we find the most fire scars. And that's true pretty much across the Appalachians. So if you're looking for fire scars, look for steep slopes, look for west and south facing aspects. Once you get there, we did find lots of trees. We walked around. My students and I basically canvassed a square kilometer area trying to find every single piece of fire evidence that we could find. And when we did, we GPSed them. We looked at what direction the fire scar was facing on the tree, which was often uphill, but not always. We figured out the species of the tree if we could. This dead one here is a pine of some sort. Could be pitch pine, most likely, but also Table Mountain pine, Virginia pine, there's some others in the area that it could be. And we collected a section of the tree. So I'm cutting off a wheel or a tree cookie from this snag right here, and I'll take that back to the lab. We did veg plots as well. We did 2 500 square meter plots where we looked at all the living trees, and we cored everything that was greater than 4 inches in diameter to try to put together an age structure. But that also gives us a sort of a picture of what the forest is today, so that we can look at how history influences that later on. Crystal is standing next to one of the best fire scars I've ever seen. In fire scar lingo, this is a cat face. I'm not really sure how it looks like a cat, but maybe somebody else in the audience can help us out with that. But this is a place where multiple fires created nested scars on the side of this tree. This is a very healthy living tree, and so I wouldn't want to cut that whole tree down. Instead, I'd cut a section out of it, a pie slice, using plunge cuts with my chainsaw. So if it was dead, I did a wheel. If it was living, I tried to save the tree by taking this pie slice, and the pine is going to cover this in pitch, and it will be perfectly fine decades later. You can already see the pitch coming out right here. These samples down on the lower right are packaged up in like that cellophane tape that you get for moving on these large rolls, and that helps hold the samples together because these are really fragile. We don't want them to fall apart before we get back to the lab. So here's a picture of that tree that Crystal was standing next to. That's called a recorder tree, and this is gold from a dendrochronology standpoint. This tree has at least 7 nested fire scars on it, and likely there are even more inside. This tree was not killed by any of these fires. They were all surface fires. Once it scarred the first time, there was a little divot in the tree, and that divot tended to collect more pine needles and leaves and debris, and so there's more fuel there for a hotter fire the next time. Also, the tree injects the wound with pitch, and pitch, as you know, is highly flammable. So once a tree gets scarred once, it's more likely to scar in the same place again, and this one's scarred at least 7 times in a row. Now this part right here is healing over, probably hasn't scarred for quite a while because we've got quite a bit of living tree here outside of the scar since the last fire. So we're looking specifically for recorder trees, but we're also looking for pieces of dead trees that have fires on them. And this is what we eventually want to do. Want to sand it down so that we can see the fire scars. This is a piece of a dead tree, sample number 42. And in cross-section, you can really see nicely where these fire scar contacts were. There's one here, there's one here, there's actually a second one right there. Then there's a fire here, and then the second one right there. So this one has at least 5 that I can see with the naked eye. So that's a really nice recorder tree. Now, who knows how big this tree was originally? So much of it is rotted away. There could be quite a bit of biomass, rings and rings and rings on the outside of this. So part of what I need to do is not just identify where the fire scars are, but date it to figure out, okay, when was this growing? And what dates were these fire scars actually made? So to do that, in general, we sand things smooth, and we use multiple grades of sandpaper from like a 40 grit, which is really, really coarse, to smooth out the chainsaw marks, all the way up to 600, or even I've gone to 1200 or 1600 grit with some of them. Because you want to be able to see the cell structure under the microscope so that you can measure annual ring widths. Then what we do is we take those measurements of the ring widths and compare them to each other to cross-date the samples. And that's a way of quality control that I'll explain in just a minute. And once we have actual years and seasons for those fire scars, then we can report them out. But to get from this to that other sample, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Broken samples need to be glued, and so you glue them and then you clamp them, and hopefully everything stays together. And when you're sanding, things will break again and you have to glue them again. Sometimes you can glue these down to plywood boards, and that helps. Here's a bunch of samples in prep in my lab, and this is a really good wood glue that I use to do this work. Here's the sanding station on the left. I use belt sanders. Really good, high quality, heavy belt sanders work really well. And we grind these down. And here's the side of this sample here. We want to eventually get it to the point where you can see the cell structure under the scope. And I've got a camera on this microscope, and here it is on the computer. This is the computer I'm sitting at right now. So I can get a nice view for you later if you want during question and answers. Here's a closer up view of another sample. Here's the whole sample. Here's this area right here is right here. This fire scar right here is what you see in the lower right. And you can see that without sanding really, really well, you'd miss some of these rings down here. So you need to see the cell structure. So what that means is you need to flatten it out and polish it, eventually using a grit of sandpaper where the spacing between the grits is smaller than the spacing between the xylem tracheids in the tree. Once you've measured all of those rings, you can plot them, and that's what this is. This is a program called TylerBow, made by Peter Brewer, who's a pretty awesome programmer in dendrochronology. We have here, this is one tree, and these troughs here are very narrow rings. Whoops, and I've got them, I was outlining them there. There's certain years where you have very, very narrow rings, and all the trees drop off. These are what we call marker years in dendrochronology, and they seem to be conserved across the trees at the site. So all the trees were experiencing the same droughts. They were all experiencing the same events like fires, and so they're all going to have reduced growth at the same time. So this is one way to line up your fire scars by, or not, you're not lining up fire scars, you're lining up ring widths. your years with narrow ring widths all line up. At least they should. And this is how you can figure out where a sample, a floating sample that you don't have an outside date for, actually fits in the chronology. Now I've put fire dates on this graph, little flame icons. I don't date the samples using the fire dates. I date them based on the ring measurements, and then you click the button and the fires appear, and you're like, oh wow. In this year right here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fires, and they all lined up. So that's something that you want to do later. If you're dating the dates of fire scars by using fire scar placement, that's not best practice. What you really need to do is to match up the ring widths. So visual cross-dating is where you start. Once you think you've got them matched up, as good as you can get by eye, then you can start to do some statistical correlation. This is from a program called DPL Art by Andrew Bunn. And it's basically doing what COFETCHA does. So many of you may be familiar with Henry Gracino Mayer's COFETCHA program, but generally what it does is it takes segments of your cores or your samples, and it correlates them with other segments in the same year. If you have a good correlation, you've probably placed it right on the timeline. So all the blue here is good correlation. So all of these samples work pretty well with each other. Where you see red, that's where there might be a little bit of an issue. You might want to look closer. So let me show you how you would actually look closer. We'll look at this sample right here, number 42, which is the floating sample that I showed you earlier. That one right there. And you can zoom in on that one sample and compare how well it matches up with everybody else. Each of these represents 2 decades worth of information. So we got 1850 to 1869, 1860 to 1879, and so on. The 0 marker is where we have it currently placed. The red ball is fairly high, and that indicates the level of correlation. So between 1850 and 1869, this tree is correlating fairly well with the rest of them. So right around 0.5. Henry Gracino Mayer would say that a correlation of 0.32 would be significant for matching up segments. So we're doing pretty well in 1850, 1860 to 1879, again, really good correlation. So I think this tree is dated properly. If it was off, then the best correlation would be like 1 over in either direction. And you can get that because maybe you missed a ring. Maybe you called a false ring 2 rings instead, where it's actually 1. If you get off track, this will actually show you. And it can pinpoint the decade in which you need to go look to see where did I screw up. So in this picture right here, you can see that there's a very, very, very tiny ring right there that's only a couple of cells wide. That's a micro ring, and this one doesn't even show up everywhere around the circumference of the tree. This only appears in certain blobs occasionally. So I missed this, and it didn't match up. So I found it on the previous graph that in a certain decade, everything got off by 1, went back, searched a little bit, found the micro ring, put it in, and then voila, everything matches. So cross-dating really helps you find these errors, and that's really going to be important, not only for all your samples, but in particular your floating samples where you don't have a known outside date. You really have to match them up really, really well, and we can get statistical confidence with some of these really cool programs. So what you've all been waiting for is a fire history diagram of Catoctin. Once we know the dates of all the annual rings, you can date the fire scars, and then you can plot the fire scars on the timeline. That's what this is. Many of you may have seen these before, but probably some in the audience have not, so I'll just describe what's going on. Every one of these horizontal lines represents the part of the timeline that a sample has rings for. So these samples up here, they all reach to 2015, which was the last complete ring that the trees finished before I cut the samples. back in 2016. So that these trees will reach back, oh, I don't know, right around to the turn of the 20th century. Now, these samples here are floating samples, not that one. This one's a good floating sample. It doesn't have bark on the outside, so the only way to figure out where that went was to cross-date it, and once we did, a lot of its fires match up with the other trees. Oh, by the way, these vertical hash marks are fire scars. So 1872, for example, is a year in which there are fire scars on a lot of my samples. But there are 55 fires on these 20 samples. In fact, there are 100 fire scars, but 55 fire years that were identified from these 20 samples. And the mean fire interval on average is 4.6 years. So can you imagine every 5 years of fire happening? That's what it used to do. The Weibull median interval, if you know what that is about 3.3 years. Ask me about that in the questions if you really want to know what that is. But we have a period of really frequent fires that sort of ends in the 1950s when the National Park Service takes over and Catoctin Park becomes a national park site. Now we still have a few fire scars after that point, but 1936 is the last year in which we have a fire that scars multiple trees at the same time. So the composite at the bottom now only shows fires that hit 2 or more trees. So there's 17 of those fires, and the mean fire interval for those is about 8 years. So this is consistent with what we know about disturbances in general, that the worse they are or the more intense they are, the less frequent they are. So if we include all the fires, we have a lot narrower period of time in between them. So some of these fires actually hit the news. So Gabe Cahalan from the Nature Conservancy did some archive work, and in the Baltimore Sun in particular, there are lots of articles describing Catoctin fires. So for example, in 1923 in April, there were 300 men out fighting a 6,000 acre burn that you could hear from town. You could hear the roar of the fire. So that's pretty neat. If you go back to 1923, that is this fire right here, where all those samples sort of line up with each other. The major fire years that we see in the tree ring record in 1879, 1923, 1936, they all have newspaper articles that back them up. But what I think is really cool about the newspaper articles is they give us actual dates, whereas the fire scars can tell us the position in the annual ring where the fire happened, like dormant season, early wood, late wood, and generally give us the season of the year. If you can match up a fire date with a newspaper article, you've got an actual time period. And so Gabe's going to be working on that and hopefully presenting at the Fire Congress on the newspaper study that he's done. So look out for that. So the seasonality that he's seeing, or that we're seeing in these scars, actually, it varies. So if we have a dormant season burn, that could be the fall of the previous year or the spring of the current year before leaf out. April for 1923 was a dormant season burn for all the samples that recorded that burn. But there are some March trees and other fires that some of them register March as a dormant burn. Other trees that had started up register it as an early wood burn. So I think it's really interesting. We can put some real dates on what dormant, early wood, late wood, and so forth actually mean. Here is a collage of various articles that Gabe found about Catoctin. So looking at seasonality, most of these fires were happening in the dormant season. So in other words, they happened between annual rings. So after the tree went into its hibernation for winter and before it starts up in the spring. So 89% of all the fires that I just showed you were dormant season burns. We have a couple of early wood and late wood burns here. U is unknown, but these are dormant. So it doesn't matter whether you're looking in that frequent fire period before 1936, or whether you're looking, 1937 to present. The majority are dormant in both cases. This is actually consistent with what we know from most fire history studies in the Appalachians. Now, from a weather standpoint, I was expecting that these fires would be burning in dry years. This graph is called a superposed epoch analysis. And what it does is it takes all 55 of those fires and lumps them over each other so that they all happen at year 0 on the graph. So year 0 is right here. That's at this point. This is where the fire icon is. On our y-axis, we have Palmer Drought Severity Index, and the 0 marker here is the average PDSI for the time periods that we're looking at, which is 1895 to present, because I can't get it to go back before 1895 from the NOAA website. We'd really like to get that, so if anyone has that data, let me know. But if your PDSI is below average in a fire year, that's sort of what I was looking for. It turns out we have drier years 1 year before the fire and in the year of the fire. So we have a little bit of context of drought. It's not significant, though, unless it goes below this line. So we have a trend indicating that we have some drier years right before and during most of these fires, but it's not a significant trend. What I find is really interesting is this bar right here. 3 years prior to the fire, we have a significantly wet year. Crosses the line up here, so it's significant. What this will do is you get a lot of rain, you generate a lot of fine fuels, which then dry out here, and then all you need is an ignition source. And in Catoctin, with the iron furnace and the charcoaling operations and the railroad and berry pickers and everything else, there are plenty of opportunities for ignitions, and that's where the fires occur. So this was really cool. I wasn't originally thinking this, but it makes a lot of sense that we have wet years prior to the fires. And we know that happens in other areas, like out in California. If you have a really wet year like you're having right now, it means that fire seasons are going to be severe a couple of years in the future. All right. So let's turn to some ecology and look at the present day forest. I expected to see sort of a regeneration issue with our fire adapted pines and oaks, and maybe an increase in regeneration in mesic species. So let's see if that actually happened. This is a size structure diagram. So these are diameter classes across the bottom in inches. So saplings are less than 4 inches, but at least breast height. 4 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19 inches, and so forth. The trees aren't super huge at this site because most of the living trees started around 1900 or so. So they haven't had time to get tremendous. So we don't have anybody in the greater than 20 stage yet. Yellow is pine. So we're looking at pitch pine primarily, but also, there's a few Table Mountain pines, Virginia pines, and others out there. Pitch pine is not the dominant species in this forest. It does exist as a canopy component, but you can see there are no yellow bars in the smaller size classes. So pitch pine is there as a canopy tree, not reproducing, which is consistent with what I expected. All of our oaks, including chestnut oak, black oak, scarlet oak, and occasionally a white oak, are these gray bars. Oaks are doing well across pretty much the entire size class distribution. However, I would think that, if oak were continuing to increase in this forest, we would expect a J-shaped curve here, reverse J. And having this few oak saplings compared to this number of pole-sized trees leads me to believe that oak reproduced a lot better in the past than it is currently at this site. Orange is black gum. So remember the picture I showed you of the canopy? There's a lot of shading going on from mid-story black gums. And you can see that there are small ones, not a lot of big ones, like the oaks and pines. We have mid-story and small black gums that are doing fairly well. So 6 months ago, I would have told you that looks like black gum is coming up underneath our pine oak forest, or oak pine forest, and maybe the next stage of succession. It may be an example of mesification. If you were at my talk 6 months ago, I'll retract that right now because I now have age structure information to go with the size structure information. Stephen, who's an undergraduate student of mine, worked this up for his senior thesis just a month ago. And what we see here is, here's our timeline. This is the appearance of different trees that currently are living in the forest canopy today. So the oldest trees are pines. Here are the yellow trees. They're increasing right around the turn of the century. But after about 1910, you never get more pines because they just hang on, and they're still alive today. So pine reproduction stops, well, it really stops right there. Starting around the 1920s, 30s, 40s, this is when the oaks and black gums really start to take off. So the gray component here represents the oaks, and you get a lot of oaks coming into the forest, and they're still here. So out here in the 2010s, we still have them. The thing that was interesting to me is black gums are not a new arrival. Even though they're small, they came in at the same time as the oaks, got overtopped and suppressed, and they've just been growing really slowly ever since. What this means is, except for this, this errant beech that's in blue right here that came in 1960, the composition of this forest has not changed. It was basically established really by the 1940s or 1960s at the latest, and it has been frozen. Succession hasn't happened at all. Since that time, we've had no new arrivals at the site in terms of trees that are at least 4 inches in diameter. So black gum does not seem to be coming in as evidence of mesification because it was there all along. What we're seeing is a regeneration failure of just about everything. So let me wrap up here and give you some major conclusions. So I would have really liked to tell you something about the pre-European fire regime. Right now, I don't have trees that are that old. I got back to the 1750s so far. I have a few other Catoctin trees I can add in that might be older than that. We'll see. But we know a lot about the 19th and 20th centuries based on this information. We had lots of frequent fires, which is consistent with our hypothesis and with the fact that we had the charcoal iron industry booming in the 1800s. In the first half of the 20th century, the charcoal iron furnaces had shut down, but we had the Great Depression, we have logging, we have berry picking, so there are lots of other ignition sources going on in the early 20th century. We don't see as many fires after the 1950s when the National Park Service takes over Catoctin. The last big one was in 1936, just before Catoctin became a park, and coincidentally, 1936, right after that is when the CCC came in and they built a lot of the park buildings, and at that point, 1936 is when this went from being an industrial landscape to a park landscape. Most of the fires that we see occur in the dormant season, 89% of them. And this is consistent with just about every other Appalachian fire history study that I've read. In terms of connection with weather, fires occurred 3 years after significantly wet years, and they occurred during dry years, but not significantly dry. If I add some more trees, maybe the increased sample size will tease that out a little bit more. But surprisingly, I'm not seeing mesification necessarily. What I'm seeing is a frozen succession, where since the 1960s, the forest hasn't really changed. We've got nothing new. We haven't lost anything. And the mid-story black gums are actually just as old as the oaks that tower above them. So what do we do? What do we do with this information? Fire history studies like this can provide managers with a historical context. So if they want to know where this forest came from, what it was like back then, what the fire frequency was, and so forth. Fire history studies can do that. They can provide proof that fire was a really important component of the ecology back at the time when this forest began growing. And we know that oaks and pines are fire-adapted species. They have thick bark. They can resprout. You know, we can talk about fire adaptations later, but these fire-adapted species germinated and arose during a time period with frequent fire. And now that we don't have frequent fire anymore, they are not reproducing. To what extent is that the lack of fire and not other variables? That's an open question. And I think a lot more ecological work has to go into this. But if you look at the picture on the right, you can see the lack of regeneration, but you can also see an influx of invasives. This is Japanese stilt grass in the front. You can see that there's hardly anything in terms of the sapling stage. That's primarily, I think, because of a really big deer population. In national parks, there's no hunting. So the deer are probably pretty happy in this area. And they're eating lots of the regeneration. So whatever happens, whatever grows up is immediately lunch. So just adding fire back into this forest is not by itself going to be a silver bullet. But fire is a tool that can be used alongside of other management tools, like silviculture, you know, controlling deer, controlling invasives and other types of things that could be used to manage Catoctin. So with that, I would like to thank all of the different stakeholders that helped me out here, the Nature Conservancy, and Gabe Cahalan in particular, but also an anonymous donor that gave the Nature Conservancy the money that they provided to do the study. So if you're the anonymous donor and you're here, thank you very much. Also, we got permission to do this work from Catoctin Mountain Park and the National Park Service. All of the trees that I showed you are actually National Park Service property, and we're going back to them as soon as we're done with all of this. So I'd also like to thank all of the undergraduates who have helped me do this work. So all of these students here have contributed to the project in all sorts of different ways. They've been doing a lot of sanding, they've been mounting and measuring and all sorts of things. And it's been great working with them on their senior thesis projects. Also, Arcadia has provided some money to do this work. I'd also like to thank my wife, Joy, who not only is, you know, she's an English PhD, but she loves to be out in the woods and is a great help doing this work as well. We've always had fun doing field work together. So with that, I will end the presentation and we can move to question and answers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was fabulous. And we have several questions that have come in. And just a heads up to folks, if you can stick around a little bit, Lauren can, with this technology, can show off some of the toys in this lab. So our first question that came in, Lauren, is what is the geographical distribution of these trees? Can you estimate fire size from this?
Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay, great. So all of these fire scars are collected from about a 1 square kilometer area. So there are two different places where we found them. Like the hillside goes up, but it sort of goes up steep and then becomes flat and becomes steep again. So we have the two steep sections. It would be really interesting to see if the same fires are affecting both. I suspect that they are. I haven't had a chance to sort of go through the GPS data at this point to see exactly where these trees are on the site, but that's coming up. That's something I've got on my to-do list. We are incidentally doing the same work in some other wildlife management areas in Western Maryland, like Sidling Hill Creek, like Indian Springs. So we're gonna have lots of other sites to compare Catoctin to, and a few one-off trees that we found that are between some of these study areas. So it is possible that in certain really hot, fiery years, there may be some fires that have burned in more than one site.
Cool, great. We have another question asking if you're planning to do any outreach or education on this topic. This question came from someone who grew up in Western Maryland and who hadn't been aware about the fire adapted nature of the forest until she started working in the field.
Mm-hmm. That's part of the reason I'm doing the webinar right now. I've given a talk to the Philadelphia Botanical Society about this, and I'm open to giving more presentations. I've led a field trip for the Fire Learning Network in Western Maryland, where we actually went up to Sidling Hill Creek and looked at fire scars and stumps and things like that, and I brought some samples along. The Nature Conservancy is doing a lot of outreach because they're the ones who are burning in Maryland. And at Sidling Hill Creek, for example, they recently conducted a burn, but they had to go out and talk to all the landowners first and explain, this is what we're doing, this is why we need to do it, these are the benefits, this is the history. So I feel like the work that we're doing sort of sets the stage for that. So they're going to be using this information a lot, I suspect, in public outreach. I'm always in favor of that. I feel like the more that we can get the science not only into the hands of the practitioners, but into the hands of the people who own the land and the people who make decisions in town, the better off that we'll be. So, and that's why I'm involved in NAFC to begin with.
Nice. Let's see, we had another comment/question. Chris Gitterman says, really impressive talk. Do you think the forest pre-1900 was heavily dominated by pines, perhaps with open structure? Then once fire declined, the oaks and the HDs came in. Pine forest would be consistent with your 3-year lag of wet conditions in your SEA.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. If you look at the living trees, the oldest ones I've got are the pines. And the oaks didn't come in until later. Let me actually pull that slide back up. Wait a second. I'm gonna figure out how to do this. Go back to my keynote. I'm thinking about this one right here. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so it doesn't really look like we have an oak component in the tree canopy until about 1930. So prior to that, we have lots of pines, but oaks would have been fuel for the furnaces, right? So I bet they were there, but they were constantly preferentially coppiced and logged off and then turned into charcoal for quite some time. But yeah, I imagine pines were a lot more important in the past than they currently are. They're only a small fraction of the forest canopy today. Did I answer everything about that question? I seem to feel like maybe I missed something. Where's our...
Well, he asked also if you had any oak stumps, or did they rot out? They
tend to rot out, unfortunately. So while the oaks are still living, some of them do compartmentalize the fire scars nicely. But a lot of the oaks we found are actually hollow. They sort of rotted away. So it's possible that the oaks do extend back further, but I don't have evidence of that right now. And keep in mind, these are cores of living trees. If we want to go to... we want to find fire-scarred trees in general. At this site, at Catoctin, I don't have hardly any oaks. Now, if you go west about 40 miles to Sword Mountain, I have more chestnut oaks that scarred and preserve the fire scars, but here, not so much.
Got it, thank you.
No problem.
We had another question about trees. Is there any evidence about how the beach ended up getting established there?
I have no idea. That's a good question. So yeah, there's that one beach. This goes up to 5 at this line. So that's one individual that got started in 1960. Beech nuts are carried by critters. So maybe it was a raven or a crow or a blue jay or something just, carrying that thing and then oops, dropped it. That's a good question. But beech is a very, very shade-tolerant species. I'm sure it's going to be very happy there. And if you let this go on without disturbance for another 100 or 2 years, I'm sure the beech would increase.
Nice. We had another question. Approximately what calendar date, early or late in what month, would you assign to cessation of diameter growth? In other words, how do you define initiation of dormant season?
Okay, so let me actually throw a sample on the on the microscope for you.
Sounds
So
good.
I have, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so actually, first of all, let me show you the sample. Can you see me now?
We can see you now.
Here it is. So this is sample number 50. So I'm going to throw this under the microscope, but you can see that there are a lot of fire scars here. But I'll show the detail of the rings as well on the scope. So I'm putting it on the scope. I'm going to pull up the microscope program. So let me give you a nice little scar. All right, so I'm going to zoom in on this a little. What you want is to be able to see the cell structure. We're doing pretty good with that. We'll change the light, see if I can get a better angle. I guess that's about the best we're going to do. All right, so what we've got here is the dormant season of the year before the fire. Then we have the lighter colored early wood, which is the more water transporting tracheids that are very wide and have thin cell walls. Then at the end of the year, the tree switches to late wood, which has thicker cell walls, thinner water carrying lumens in those cells, and it's more dense wood. And so that's why it's darker here. So light is early wood, dark is late wood. The end of the year, the contact point here, would be the dormant season. So I'm going to shift over this way a little. So let's see, this would be year number, let's see, 40, so it looks like I wrote 45D. The first year on the sample is, first complete year is year 1. But anyhow, this is year 44. Year 45 is right here. It's this really narrow year. This is 46, 47, 48, so on. This fire killed the cambium, or the living part of the tree in this area. It was hot enough to kill the cells there, but to the left of my arrow, it didn't. So this cambium was alive, and it was able to grow the next year. So what you can see is that in the part with the scar, we don't have any evidence that we had any of the next year growing first before we had to hit the fire. The fire happened after this year, number 44 was completed, but before number 45 started growing. That's why I call this a dormant season burn. Does that answer the question all right?
I think pretty thoroughly. Thank you, Lauren.
Just about everything
Wow.
is a dormant season burn. So here's another one, 52D. Zoom in on it for you. Sorry, I don't want to make anyone car sick here. All right. So this is year 51, that's year 52, and here's your fire scar. And it's right on the contact, right at the end of the late wood, before the early wood of the next year. So another dormant season burn. And just for fun, let me share something else. Here's my, what I want is tree number 50. Let's see, what color is tree number 50? Oh, it's this blue one right here. So let's see, that tree got started in 1837. And I believe, let's see, that was the third and the fourth scar. So 1, 2, 3, okay, so here you are. That was the first scar I showed you, was right here, 1872. And the second one I showed you was 1879, only 7 years later. And there are many other trees that in 1872 that show that same fire. In 1879, there's one other tree that shows that same fire.
Oh, very cool. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So just a quick time check. We're actually a few minutes after the top of the hour. This is really exciting stuff. If folks need to go, thank you so much for joining us. But if you have more questions, please stay on. And I think Lauren has a few more minutes to help answer questions. I should point out that as we were preparing for this webinar, Lauren consciously decided, as you mentioned earlier, to focus on kind of methodology and fire history for this webinar, and later we'll probably do another webinar that's just on your study and what you are continuing to find as you keep analyzing and reanalyzing data. So thanks everybody for joining us. And again, if you have questions, feel free to stay on. So I think the same.
Thank you for coming.
Yay, thanks, Lauren. So a follow-up question to the dormant season question was late July, early August. You say many fires started by berry pickers. I have seen reports where berry pickers started fires at the end of the picking season.
Oh, interesting. So July or August, well, July would definitely not be dormant season. August may or may not be dormant season. It depends on if you're in the middle of a drought. So if the trees shut down in August, it's got to be pretty dry and hot. There's not much growing that's going on. So probably if you're looking at late July and August, you're in a late wood sort of situation. Although, you know, one of the newspaper articles showed was an August burn. So let's check that out. Go back to my presentation real quick. Where is that? Keynote. Back up. So yeah, what date is this? 1893 fire, August 14th, 1893. Let's go to 1893 on the fire history diagram. Let's see, 1893 would be, yeah, look at that. We have a fire in 1894 on sample number 24. So let me just quick look that up. Sample number 24 has all dormant season burns on it. So would that make sense? So if we have, and it was August of 1893 in the newspaper, and dormant of 1894 on the tree. That does make sense because we are treating the dormant season as the beginning of the year, but in actuality, it doesn't necessarily have to be a spring burn. You can get a dormant scar in the fall of the previous year. So yeah, if 1893 was a really dry year and the trees shut down by August, that could manifest as a dormant scar, which I would assign to 1894. Because just by convention, dormant is at the beginning of the year in the way that we do this.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification.
Thanks for asking that question.
Yeah, so I think everybody can see that you can have a lot of fun and ask a lot of questions about fire history by reading this fire scar data. Yeah, Lauren, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and your continuing studies with us. We look forward to learning more. And thanks again so much for taking the time to give this webinar today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks to everybody for coming and hanging out with me. I really appreciate it, and I hope it's been fun. It has for me.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
Take care, everyone.